The world knew her for the wild hair, the iconic cackle, and the endless jokes about her family. But every Sunday for 33 years, Phyllis Diller drove to a locked institution to visit a daughter the public didn't even know existed. Why did America's favorite funny housewife keep her child a secret until the very end? This is the heartbreaking story Phyllis Diller never told her fans. To truly understand the magnitude of this secret, you have to understand who Phyllis Diller was to the American public in the mid-20th century. She was not just a comedian. She was a cultural phenomenon. Before Phyllis, female comedians were expected to be demure, polite, and conventionally attractive, or they were relegated to the role of the dizzy sidekick. Phyllis shattered that mold completely. She walked onto the stage in 1955 at the age of 37, a late start by any standard, wearing a fright wig that looked like she had stuck her finger in a light socket, brandishing a long cigarette holder, and unleashing a machine gun spray of self-deprecating jokes. She joked about her absolute lack of sex appeal. She joked about her fictional, famously lazy husband whom she affectionately called Fang. And most importantly for this story, she joked relentlessly about her chaotic home life and her bizarre, unruly children. The audience roared. They loved her because she voiced the silent frustrations of millions of American housewives who were exhausted by the post-war pressure to be perfect. She made domestic disaster hilarious. But when the stage lights faded, and the laughter died down in the clubs of San Francisco, and eventually the national television studios, Phyllis Diller took off the wig, wiped off the exaggerated stage makeup, and returned to a reality that was entirely devoid of punchlines. Behind closed doors, Phyllis was a mother of 6 children, trying to keep her family afloat while married to her first husband, Sherwood Diller, a man who struggled to hold down a job and battled his own deep-seated personal demons. Money was constantly tight. Stress was paralyzing. But the darkest shadow hanging over the Diller home was not poverty or marital strife. It was what was happening to her second child, a beautiful little girl named Sally, born in November of 1944. In her earliest years, Sally seemed like a typical, vibrant child. But as the 1950s rolled on, the Diller household began to notice an unsettling shift in the young girl's behavior. At first, it was easy to brush off as the eccentricities of childhood, perhaps the normal rhythms of a sensitive kid reacting to a chaotic, financially strained home. However, as Sally approached adolescence, the behavioral quirks escalated into something far more terrifying. By the time she was 11 years old, it became undeniably clear that Sally was not just acting out. The imaginary friends that some children invent to pass the time had morphed into something entirely different. They were hostile voices, voices that gave dark instructions, voices that only Sally could hear. The reality of severe mental illness began to suffocate the family. There were nights Phyllis would find her young daughter standing perilously on the edge of the rooftop. There were terrifying incidents involving scissors. At one point, Sally was found drinking highly toxic cleaning fluid, calmly explaining that the voices in her head had instructed her to do it because it would help her. This was not the kind of domestic trouble you could cure with a warm glass of milk or a stern talking to. This was schizophrenia. It was aggressive, it was early onset, and it was consuming her daughter from the inside out. You have to remember the era we are talking about. In the 1950s and early 1960s, mental illness of this severity was a source of immense social shame. There were no modern support groups. There was no widespread public understanding of neurochemistry or the genetic underpinnings of schizophrenia. Families dealing with severe psychological disorders were often blamed by society, ostracized by their communities, and left to manage their agonizing reality in total isolation. For years, Phyllis tried desperately to care for Sally at home. She balanced her burgeoning comedy career, writing copy, working at a radio station, and eventually playing clubs, all while living in constant, heart-pounding fear of what her daughter might do to herself or someone else while her back was turned. It was a daily, waking nightmare. And this brings us to a moment that changes everything we know about this comedy legend. A moment so jarring, it almost feels impossible to reconcile with the woman who made millions laugh. In 1960, when Sally was just 16 years old, the situation at home reached a breaking point. The danger was too great. The illness had won. Phyllis made the most agonizing decision a mother can ever make. She signed the papers to commit her teenage daughter to a locked psychiatric institution. She drove Sally there herself. As Phyllis prepared to leave, the 16-year-old girl screamed, cried, and begged her mother not to abandon her, fighting with the full, terrified force of a child who did not understand why she was being left behind. Phyllis walked out of that building, got into her car, drove to a comedy club, and performed 3 back-to-back stand-up shows. She stood under the spotlight, held her cigarette holder, and told jokes about her kids. She didn't miss a single beat. From that horrifying day in 1960 until Sally passed away in 1993, Phyllis Diller carried a secret so heavy it is a miracle it didn't crush her. For 33 years, every single Sunday without fail, Phyllis made the drive to the institution. Think about the logistics of that devotion. We are talking about well over 1,500 Sunday visits. She did this while becoming a household name. She did this while appearing on The Tonight Show, while starring in movies, while traveling the world, and while recording comedy albums. Yet, not once did she bring a publicist. Not once did she tip off a photographer. Not once did she mention Sally in an interview or use her for a single ounce of public sympathy. When journalists asked her about her children, she would casually list the others, completely erasing Sally from the public narrative. Sally simply did not exist to the outside world. Why? Why did a woman who built an entire empire on oversharing, on airing her family's dirty laundry, and on radical vulnerability draw such a hard, impenetrable line here? The answer is a complex mix of intense maternal protection and the brutal realities of show business. On a practical level, keeping Sally a secret protected the vulnerable young woman from the ruthless, prying eyes of the mid-century tabloid press. The media of the 1960s and 1970s would not have been kind to a schizophrenic celebrity child. They would have hounded her, sensationalized her illness, and turned her tragedy into a spectacle. Phyllis was ensuring that her daughter's suffering remained private and dignified. But on a deeper, more psychological level, the secrecy reveals something profound about the limits of comedy. Phyllis Diller was a pioneer of turning pain into punchlines. She took her own lack of conventional beauty, her husband's inadequacies, and her own failures, and she processed them through the machinery of humor. That machinery made her pain manageable. It made it lucrative. But Sally's condition resisted that process entirely. The grief of watching your child's mind slowly vanish into the labyrinth of severe schizophrenia is a grief too jagged, too intimate, and too devastating to be sanitized by a joke. If she had spoken about Sally, the reality would have pierced the carefully constructed armor of her stage persona. The public would have seen not a funny, frustrated housewife, but a deeply traumatized mother drowning in sorrow. And in the cutthroat world of entertainment, especially for a woman trying to hold onto her hard-won success, showing that kind of raw, bleeding vulnerability could have ended her career. What makes this secret even more astounding is that Sally was not the only tragedy Phyllis Diller was hiding behind her iconic laugh. The truth is, her life was a relentless parade of catastrophic heartbreak that she meticulously concealed from her fans. Years before Sally was institutionalized, in 1945, Phyllis endured the trauma of a miscarriage. Shortly after, she gave birth to a son who lived for only 2 agonizing weeks in a hospital incubator before passing away. She never spoke of him for decades, burying the pain deep inside and quietly carrying on. Later in life, the hits just kept coming. In 1998, her eldest son, Peter, succumbed to cancer and died at the age of 53. Just 4 years later, in 2002, her daughter Stephanie died suddenly of a stroke at the age of 54. Phyllis Diller, the woman whose entire brand was built on the joyful chaos of motherhood, had to bury 3 of her own children. She outlived half of the kids she brought into the world. And through it all, she never stopped working. She never canceled a tour. She never took an extended, public leave of absence to mourn. When Stephanie died, Phyllis simply stepped up and helped raise Stephanie's 3 children, stepping right back into the role of a matriarch, all while continuing to perform, paint, and voice animated characters. This is the ultimate embodiment of the sad clown paradox. The people who laugh the loudest and provide the most joy to the world are often the ones carrying burdens so heavy that an ordinary person would simply collapse under the weight. Humor, for Phyllis, was not just a career choice. It was a fiercely constructed survival mechanism. Every time she delivered a punchline, every time she let out that signature raucous cackle, it was an act of defiance against a universe that had handed her an almost unbelievable amount of sorrow. Consider the sheer cognitive dissonance required to live this dual life. Picture Phyllis Diller in the late 1960s. She is at the absolute peak of her fame. She is a regular on television. She is mingling with Bob Hope, Dean Martin, and Johnny Carson. She is draped in absurd, glittering costumes, dripping in fake jewels, surrounded by adoring fans and the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi. She is the life of every single party she walks into. Then, picture her on a Sunday morning. The makeup is gone. The wig is off. She is dressed quietly, sitting behind the wheel of her car, making the long, silent drive to the psychiatric hospital. She walks down the sterile, linoleum corridors. She sits in a quiet, locked room with a daughter who, due to the heavy medication and the relentless progression of schizophrenia, is often asleep for 20 hours a day, and during her 4 hours of wakefulness is lost in a confusing haze. Phyllis would sit there, holding her daughter's hand, speaking softly to a child who had been swallowed whole by her own mind. There were no cameras. There was no applause. There was only the crushing, silent reality of unconditional love in the face of absolute hopelessness. Then, the visit would end. Phyllis would get back in her car, drive home, put the wig back on, and go out into the world to make millions of strangers smile. Sally spent 33 years in those institutions. The disease took her mind long before her body eventually gave out. She passed away in 1993 at the age of 49. Phyllis was 76 years old when she buried her hidden daughter, having made over 1,500 visits that the world never knew about. She never spoke about Sally while she was alive, and she never spoke about her after she was gone. The secret remained buried until Phyllis herself passed away on August 20th, 2012, at the grand age of 95. It was only in the aftermath of her death, through family accounts and institutional records, that the true story finally came to light. The woman who paved the way for every modern female comedian, the woman who seemed to find everything funny, had spent her entire adult life guarding a heartbreak that possessed no punchline. Her laughter was real, but it was also a shield. A shield protecting a mother's unending devotion to a child the world was never allowed to see, proving that sometimes the brightest stage lights cast the deepest shadows.